Hey everyone, I thought I would take time to talk about the recently issued Colorado State University 2025 hurricane season forecast. Yes, it's April. The hurricane season doesn't start until June, but they put out these forecasts starting in April and then they update them throughout the season. It's an interesting look into what we think the season will look like, not necessarily with any specific details, but at least some information and some guidance on why we might think the season looks as it is. And so the hurricane season forecast from Colorado State is for above normal activity, 17 named storms, so tropical storm strength or greater. So a named storm, something off that named storm list, like an Alberto or a Beryl. Hurricanes, 9. So at least winds of 75 miles an hour or greater, or about 110 to 120 kilometers an hour or greater. And major hurricanes, 4. So category 3 strength or higher, which is above 110 miles an hour, or what is that, above about 150, 160 kilometers an hour. So you get the idea that it's going to be an above average season. These are their numbers. The other interesting thing I think from their forecast they also put out is named stormed days. They calculate the number of what they think the number of days will be with a named storm or a hurricane or a major hurricane. And so it's interesting to see here. You have 85 named storm days. So nearly 3 months, there would be somewhere in the tropical Atlantic a named tropical storm. That kind of makes sense. The season starts on June 1st, lasts all the way through the end of November. So somewhere out of that, you figure you'll probably have a long stretch where you have a named storm system all the way through, especially when you get into, say, parts of August, September, and October. Hurricane days, it's interesting, 35. So about a month, maybe a little bit more, where there's a day somewhere in there that you have a hurricane. And then major hurricane days, 9. And that's probably near the peak of hurricane season. So sometime in late August or during September, or possibly even into early October, as we've seen with Hurricane Milton. We've seen that with several hurricanes over the past several years. Now, let's talk about some of the factors that go into why we think it's going to be an above average season. There's 4 different factors that are here. I've taken a little bit of context from Colorado State and done a little bit of reading myself. And I thought this was interesting to kind of point out maybe what some of the factors are that are positive or possibly negative, or at the moment we just don't know. So let's start with ocean temperatures. Ocean temperatures are a pivotal part of tropical cyclones. They derive their energy from warm ocean waters. You generally need 25 degrees Celsius ocean temperatures for tropical cyclones to develop. So mid to upper 70s Fahrenheit. In the Pacific Ocean, when the systems get close to California, that water gets cold very quickly, and that's why those tropical cyclones never generally make it to California. On the Atlantic side, we have plenty of warm water, especially in the Caribbean and in the Gulf of Mexico, offshore of the US and Mexico. Now, part of that also is, what are the ocean temperatures compared to average? And I put up here the ocean temperature anomaly map because I think that's more important than the actual values, especially in April. We're not there yet, but where are we looking right now, and where are we looking at compared to, say, last year or other years? At the moment, we're warmer than average for the most part. You see a lot of those warmer colors, with the exception of maybe some cooler parts of the Gulf Stream and a few other locations, but we're not as warm as we were this time last year. Okay, maybe there's something to be taken from that. We think back to the early part of the season where Hurricane Beryl managed to go to a Category 5 in late June and early July, which was extremely out of season for Category 5 systems. Maybe we say, okay, maybe we won't see something quite like that. Not necessarily sure, but at least it gives you an idea that we look similar, but not maybe as potent in 2025. So at the moment, I would consider that a positive factor for an above normal season. That's why we're thinking what we're thinking. Additionally, you have ENSO, so El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is the overall global pattern based off of the water temperatures offshore of South America. Are we talking above average temperatures or below average temperatures, which is therefore an El Nino or a La Nina? And that has global impacts. It has influences on tropical cyclone development, it has influences on your winter systems in the Northern Hemisphere. It has influences on how things look for Australia in terms of whether there's rainfall or fire conditions. Overall, though, we look at the forecast ahead for the rest of the spring into summer and into fall. And as indicated by that arrow on the map there, on the graph there, we're looking at the August, September, October, so that peak of hurricane season. What are we looking at for forecast conditions for El Nino or La Nina, or potentially a neutral phase? Right now, it's looking to be more of a neutral phase of the ENSO when we get to that time of the year. But there are still some indications that La Nina is potentially more likely. I see more lines below there for the La Nina side than I do for the El Nino side. So the thought process is most likely some sort of neutral or potentially a weak La Nina. Now, what does that mean for tropical cyclone development in the Atlantic? Generally speaking, that shoves thunderstorm development a little bit farther into the Pacific, which then changes up some things closer to home. And when you get into the Atlantic, it also cuts down on wind shear. So then when you do develop these tropical cyclones, then you have a well-developed tropical cyclone. Because again, for tropical cyclones, you want less wind shear. You want to be able to get that system vertically organized all the way up through the atmosphere. So that would be a positive factor as well for the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season. Two other things are more related to what happens in Africa and what happens when those things come off of Africa. The first is precipitation in the Sahel, which is the boundary region between the Sahara, farther to the north, and the more moist savanna regions farther to the south. Last year, we had more rain in the Sahel. It was a pretty wet Sahel summer. We saw tons of flooding in areas that don't normally get a lot of precip. They're kind of in that boundary region between very dry in the desert and more moist farther to the south. And so that led to an increase in moisture there, which can sometimes lead to an increase in moisture for the waves and then coming offshore, and then eventually leads into more tropical development. So at the moment, the forecast from what I was looking at is a wetter time as we go through the summer into fall. So I'll say somewhat positive. There's a lot less known here than there is in some of the other factors that are in play, but it's something that we do keep an eye on. We have to watch those, what they're called African easterly waves, as they make their way offshore of Africa and move across, because that's how the tropical cyclones develop. Those waves move off and they develop out of those tropical waves. And then finally, there's Saharan dust. Dust is the big inhibitor of thunderstorm development in general. You see that milky kind of sky when these dust storms get moving. I mean, if you think of it from the standpoint of like a haboob, a giant dust storm, it's not all that different, but it's generally not as concentrated. But it does get into the atmosphere and propagates across the Atlantic. It can be through the Atlantic. It can be all the way into the United States. We'll have hazy days here where there's no thunderstorm activity and temperatures are actually dampened a degree or two because of Saharan dust. So when that dust comes offshore of Africa, that inhibits tropical cyclone development because it inhibits the thunderstorms. So we shall see. This factor is a question mark, and it always is, because we really don't have a great predictor several months out for what Saharan dust looks like. That's not really a good thing to do. We have for that, but we can talk about it from the standpoint of, we know when we do have significant amounts of Saharan dust, we likely won't have tropical cyclone development. And so I think last year in July, for example, up until Beryl, or I'm sorry, after Beryl, I want to say that most of July was pretty dead because we had huge amounts of dust across the Atlantic. And so where that dust is in relation to the African easterly waves that come across the Atlantic plays a role in that development. So question mark, but we know that if there is a lot of dust, numbers are down. If there isn't dust, numbers can potentially be up. So overall, those are all of the factors that are in play for the Colorado State forecast. Again, forecasting an above normal season. I see no reason to necessarily disagree with it. Most of their forecasting, their numbers are just above average, above normal, which is not necessarily a surprise, especially given that we're just now in April forecasting for June through November. So they'll update their forecast as we go throughout the hurricane season, as we get closer, and then through the season as well. Other agencies will also issue their forecasts. NOAA will issue one at some point. My suspicion is everybody is going to be relatively close to each other, generally saying right around just above normal for the forecast. So there it is. There's your look at the forecast. Thanks as always for watching.